Hi guys, welcome back. Today we'll be reading the first part of part 2 of our book, The Stolen Princess. So let's begin. Part 2. Lynadelle had no idea where she was when she woke up, but when she opened her eyes and turned her head, expecting to shrug off the dream that held her, the dream continued. She had thought that it should be the morning of her 17th birthday, but even as she thought this, the truth of it eluded her. Her mother had sat on the foot of her bed last night, hadn't she? She must remember her mother. The pillow slip under her cheek was silk, if it were cloth at all, so soft that it was unimaginable that it had ever been woven. It must have just grown, like a flower. The lace that edged it was a fragile, beautiful pattern totally unfamiliar to her. She was sure her fingers had never worked it, nor her mother's, nor any of the court ladies. She did remember, with utter certainty, that she was a princess, and no royal cheek ever touched a pillow slip of less than aristocratic origins. Her thoughts wavered again. She wished terribly that she could remember her mother's face. Not remembering made her feel far more forlorn than any strangeness of her surroundings could do. She was covered by a long, soft fur which was the elusive blue-gray of a storm cloud, and he belonged to no animal she knew. Stroking aside the long, fine hairs, she touched the downy fur underneath, and knew also that no dyer ever born could mix such a tint. She looked up. There were trees overhead, or at least she thought they were real trees. Their branches met and intertwined so gracefully as to look deliberate, the bright bits of sky scattered more credibly by a painter's inspired brush than by the cheerful, haphazard hand of nature. It seemed she was in a small meadow, and she lay on the ground on a white sheet spread over an improbably smoothed and comfortable piece of greensward. But when she put her hand out and hesitantly touched the blades that sprang out from under the edge of the white cloth upon which she lay, they felt like real grass, and she snapped one off and rubbed it between her fingers, and the smell was the good green smell she had always known. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she almost remembered what her past life had been. She frowned, and her fingers closed down on the grass blades till their sap ran onto her hand, but the memory was gone before she found it. She opened her eyes and her hand. At least the grass was the same here and wherever she had come from. She was obscurely comforted and looked around her with better heart. She did not realize that with any lifting of spirits in this land, her hold on her previous life diminished. Already there was only a thread left. That thread was her royalty, for nothing but death could make her forget that. But she did not know, and there was much here to catch her attention. The trees that surrounded her meadow and met over her head grew to a great height, with the proud arch of branches that reminded her of elms, but the luminous quality of the bark was like no elm she had seen. They stood in a ring around her, although she lay near one edge, the nearest tree being only a child's somersault away, while the one opposite was several bounds distant for the fleetest deer, and she wondered if deer ever came to this graceful tended meadow. Beyond the ring of trees was a hedge. Perhaps she was in a kind of ornamental garden, a very grand and ancient garden indeed, that had trees laid out as lesser gardens had flower beds, and had been watched over and cared for during so many years that the trees had grown to such a size and breadth. The hedge grew higher than her head, although no more than half the height of the trees, and it was starred with flowers, yellow, ivory, and white, and she thought perhaps they were responsible for the gentle, sweet smell that pervaded the air. There were arches cut through the hedge, each of them tall enough for the tallest king with the highest crown to pass through without bending his head. 4 arches, as if indicating the 4 points of the compass. She looked at each of them slowly, and through them saw more close-trimmed grass and flowers. Through the 3rd, a fountain stood in the middle of what looked like a rock garden of subtle grays and chestnuts, and through the 4th she saw people. She stood up, and the fur coverlet slipped away from her and fell in a noiseless heap at her feet. She found that her heart had risen in her throat and was beating so hard that she raised her hands as if to force it back down into her breast where it belonged. Her hands were shaking, and she dropped them, and her heart eventually subsided of its own accord. She stood looking at the people for a moment. Their clothing was bright as jewelry in the green glen, and while they were too far away for her to distinguish faces, they seemed oblivious to her. She could not see what they were doing as they moved back and forth in front of her open door, but there was something so lucid and precise about them that she was caught by the fancy of there being stones in some great necklace, the fastening of which, with her dull eyes, she could not quite make out. Then she looked calmly around her, wondering that, since she was here in her nightgown, perhaps her robe and slippers were here too. She did not really relish introducing herself to these people she saw brief, glorious bits of through the leaves of the hedge, with her hair down her back and her feet bare. But she would if she had to, for join them she must. How she came to be here, wherever here was, and why, and what she had been before, this was a thought that still made her unhappy when she stumbled over it, though the reasons got vaguer and vaguer, she would deal with later. At the moment, such thoughts would only make her heart thunder and her hands tremble again, which was unprincess-like. She did not find anything that seemed like the robe and slippers that had belonged to her. She was pretty sure they were blue and silver, but near where her feet had lain was something magnificently red, dark heart's blood red, now tangled negligently with the pale fur. When she picked it up, it shook itself out into a long gown with a waterfall of a skirt and narrow sleeves edged with gold, and under it had been hidden small gold shoes with soles as tender as the soft grass. She put the dress on with great care and laced the golden laces at waist and wrists and put her feet in the golden shoes. She pulled her hair free of its braid and shook it out, combing it with her fingers till it fell, she thought, more or less as it usually did, but she had nothing to put it up with. She shrugged, and it rippled down her back and mixed with the folds of her skirt. Then she walked, slowly, still half in her dream and half somewhere else that she could not remember, toward that arch in the hedge through which she saw the people. Just as she reached it, she paused to pluck a flower, a white one, to give her something to do with her hands besides hiding them in her skirt. She twirled it by the stem, and its perfume fanned her face. She took a deep breath and stepped through the door of the hedge. The people turned their faces toward her at once, and yet there was nothing abrupt about their gesture, nothing of a group startled by a stranger, nothing suspicious or hostile in their wide and serene gaze. Several of the women curtsied, some were standing already, others rose to do so, and some of the men bowed. And again there was so much grace in their movements, and their greeting was so spontaneous that Lynadel no longer felt alone, or even uncertain. She was a member of this kind and courteous group. She did not know these people, and yet there had never been a time when she was not a part of them. She smiled back to their smiles, and then looked around her, as she was perfectly free to do because she belonged here. She had stepped through the opening in the hedge to find herself in a clearing surrounded by another hedge, and this hedge, too, was pierced with doorways into more meadows, green with grass and trees, and bright with flowers and fountains and warm, sleek rocks. In the meadow in which she now stood, there was a ring of trees even taller than that which she had just left, and again their branches met and mingled high overhead, so she could not see the sky except as scattered bits of blue, irregular as stars in a green heaven. This meadow was several times larger than the one which she had left, so while there were a number of people in it, and all of them well-dressed and proud, and each of them an individual to recognize and respect, the effect was still of peace and quiet and space. She had walked a few steps forward as she looked, and she realized that more people were entering this ring of trees through the several arches in the hedge. No one was either oppressively still nor visibly restless, but as the minutes passed, Lynn felt that they were waiting for something, and that she was waiting too. Unconsciously, she tucked the flower she held into her bodice, and her hands fell peacefully to her sides. And I'm going to stop here so that the video isn't too long like it was the first time. I'll try to do each video in 10-minute, about 10-minute sections. So I think each part will probably be sectioned in maybe 3 or 4 parts. It kind of stops on a cliffhanger, but maybe that's cool. I don't know. So stay tuned for the next part, and thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments or anything, leave them in the comment section below, and I will reply to them. Thank you again for listening. Take care. Bye.